Hey there, Night Owl. Welcome back to another sleepy wander through the side streets of history, where the soup is suspicious, the bread can break teeth, and table manners were, let's say, creative. Tonight's Feast of Facts is all about food. Not just what medieval folks ate, but how they ate it, what they believed about it, and the odd myths that somehow survived into modern times. Spoiler alert. You're not going to find turkey legs at every banquet. And no, they didn't all eat gruel in the dirt. Well, not all of them. So before we tuck in, do the usual bedtime routine. Like the video if it feeds your curiosity, subscribe if you want seconds, and leave a comment telling me your favorite medieval-sounding snack. Pottage and pickled turnip. Perhaps? Now dim the lights. Maybe grab a warm drink. Not small beer, unless you've got a time machine. And let's begin with a humble loaf of bread. Or rather, a medieval weapon disguised as dinner. Let's start with bread. It was everywhere. It was everything. It was, frankly, borderline sacred. But if you think medieval bread was all golden crusts and fluffy centers, allow me to introduce you to the tragic tale of the trencher. A trencher, in medieval dining, was a flat, thick slice of stale bread used as a plate. That's right. Your dinner sat directly on a piece of bread so dry it could deflect arrows. After the meal, you didn't eat it, not unless you were very hungry or had no remaining teeth to worry about. Instead, the trencher was either tossed to the dogs, given to the poor, or reused, which is a sentence I regret having to write. Now, not all bread was built like medieval roofing tiles. Wealthier folks had access to fine white bread called manchet, made from sifted wheat flour. It was soft, fluffy, and white. Not because it was more nutritious, but because it looked cleaner. The whiter the bread, the higher your social status. If you were rich, your bread looked like clouds. If you were poor, your bread looked like gravel glued together with sadness. And then there was rye. Rye bread was common among peasants, but rye has a dark side, ergot. This delightful little fungus can grow on rye and causes hallucinations, convulsions, and, in some theories, entire witch trials. If your bread made you see dancing devils or think your neighbor was possessed, well, now you know why. Bread also wasn't sliced. That's a modern invention. In the Middle Ages, you tore your bread, shared it, dipped it in communal stews, and wiped your fingers on it, because napkins were for the noble or the overly optimistic. There's even a common myth that medieval people couldn't afford yeast or didn't know how to use it. Not true. They used sourdough starters and ale barm, yeasty foam from beer brewing, to help dough rise. So, yes, your ancestors were doing sourdough before it was cool. And no, they didn't Instagram it. In short, bread was essential. It was plate, napkin, status symbol, and mild hallucinogen all rolled into one. Let's talk about meat. Glorious, sizzling, rich in protein meat. Or rather, the fantasy of it. If your mental image of a medieval feast includes endless turkey legs and roast boar dripping with honey, prepare for a culinary reality check. In truth, meat was rare for most people, not just because it was expensive, but because, depending on what you were hunting, or rather poaching, you could end up dining in prison. Or worse, not dining ever again. You see, in medieval Europe, most forests and game animals were reserved for nobility. Deer, wild boar, rabbits, and even certain species of birds were considered property of the local lord or king. If you were caught snaring a rabbit in the royal woods, you weren't just a hungry peasant, you were a criminal. And not the fun kind with a cool outlaw name. Just a very cold, very nervous one. To eat meat legally, you had to raise it yourself. Chickens, pigs, maybe a goat or two if you were lucky. But here's the catch. Most of these animals were more valuable alive. Chickens laid eggs. Goats gave milk. Pigs. Well, pigs were food factories, sure, but killing one meant you lost your walking compost bin, garbage disposal, and potential winter blanket all in one. So what did people do? They stretched meat. You'd have a tiny scrap of bacon, emphasis on tiny, and you'd toss it into a stew to flavor the entire pot. It was more about the illusion of meat than the meal itself. The bacon acted like a guest appearance in a sitcom, brief, exciting, and nowhere near enough screen time. And when meat was available, it was often preserved, salted, smoked, dried, until it resembled medieval beef jerky, which, to be fair, might still be in someone's cellar today, waiting patiently for a dental lawsuit. Preservation was vital, but it wasn't exactly delicious. Picture meat so salty it made you weep, and then made you thirsty enough to drink rainwater off your neighbor's roof. Welcome to Tuesday. But even salted meat was a dream compared to what medieval cookbooks actually describe. Beavers were eaten. Hedgehogs too. In some areas, people made pies out of blackbirds. And yes, they really did sing. Until they didn't. Here's where things get weirdly theological. During Lent and other fasting periods, the church forbade meat. But fish was allowed. So medieval cooks got creative. Beaver, for instance, was declared a fish. Why? Because it had a scaly tail and lived in water. That was enough ecclesiastical loophole to make beaver tail stew a Friday night staple. Otters occasionally made the cut, too. Salmon? Too expensive. Beaver? Surprisingly pious. And those great medieval feasts we picture? Yes, they existed, but for the wealthy. Roasted swans with gilded feathers, peacocks served with their own plumage, pies stuffed with live birds for surprise entertainment. But these events weren't everyday meals. They were spectacles, culinary theater with a death toll. So if you were a regular medieval soul-craving meat, you had options. Raise it and eat it once a year. Poach it and pray you weren't caught. Pretend it was fish and hope the bishop wasn't watching. Lick the bacon spoon and imagine a world where pigs fell from the sky. And even when you did get a piece of meat, it might not be what you thought. No FDA, no expiry dates. Just your nose and a vague prayer to St. Eustace, patron saint of hunters, cooks, and poor dietary decisions. Imagine seasoning your stew with a pinch of black pepper and accidentally using something more valuable than your entire cloak. Welcome to the spice life of medieval Europe, where the pantry doubled as a bank vault and a dash of flavor could cost you your dignity, or at least your week's wages. Let's clear something up first. Medieval food wasn't universally bland. That's a common myth, alongside the one about people using spices to cover the taste of rotting meat. Spoiler, they didn't. Spices were too expensive to waste on bad pork. If your meat was questionable, you didn't reach for saffron. You reached for prayer. So what made spices so special? For starters, they had to travel thousands of miles to get to Europe, usually via camel, ship, or some very patient merchant. Pepper came from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, cloves and nutmeg sailed in from the Spice Islands, today's Indonesia. By the time they reached a European table, these tiny ingredients had more frequent flyer miles than most modern humans. As a result, spices were less about taste and more about status. Think of it as culinary peacocking. Hosting a feast? Better sprinkle some cinnamon on your roast beef. Not because it made sense, it didn't, but because it made your guests gasp. In the medieval world, if your tongue wasn't slightly confused, you weren't rich enough. And, oh, the combinations. Noble kitchens loved sweet and sour flavors, not in the comforting orange chicken sense, but more like, here's a chicken stuffed with raisins and topped with sugar and vinegar. It was like every dish dared your taste buds to revolt. Imagine fish cooked with ginger, saffron, and almond milk. Or beef in a honey and clove glaze. Every bite was a medieval mystery box. For those who couldn't afford imported luxury, local herbs were the go-to. Sage, parsley, mustard seeds, garlic, and the ever-popular whatever's growing near the goat pen. These herbs were used not just for taste, but for health. Because yes, medieval folks firmly believed your dinner could cure you, or at least rearrange your bodily humors in a less annoying way. Speaking of which, humor-based medicine meant spices had symbolic meanings. Black pepper was hot and dry, perfect for balancing cold, phlegmatic personalities. Cinnamon, also hot, but more refined. Nutmeg, mysterious, expensive, possibly magical. You didn't just season your stew, you seasoned your soul. And then there was saffron. Ah, saffron. Still pricey today, but in medieval times, practically edible gold. It took thousands of crocus flowers to make a single ounce. That didn't stop people from sprinkling it on everything from soups to dessert. Yellow food? That meant power. It also meant someone in the kitchen spent 8 hours plucking tiny stigmas with tweezers and regret. For the record, there were spice frauds too. Some shady merchants sold powdered brick instead of cinnamon. Others dyed random plant matter to mimic saffron. It was a medieval version of, I ordered this online, and it looked different in the picture. And just to add spice to the story, literally, spices were often kept under lock and key. Wealthy homes had spice boxes with separate compartments for each treasure. These weren't kitchen tools, they were vaults. Want a pinch of nutmeg? Better be on good terms with the cook, or the butler, or the house goat, depending on who had the key. So no, they didn't drown bad meat in spices. They hoarded their cardamom like it was currency. Because in a world where you might die from drinking the water or hugging a chicken, a little cinnamon was the closest thing to heaven. Let's say you've made it to a medieval dinner. Congratulations! The bread hasn't broken your teeth, the meat hasn't poisoned you, and the saffron didn't bankrupt your family. But before you reach for that roasted hedgehog or honey-glazed partridge, pause. You're being watched. Because medieval table manners were a real thing, and if you got them wrong, you might not get invited back. Or worse, you'd become the punchline of a particularly passive-aggressive ballad. First things first, there were no forks. Not for most of the Middle Ages. The fork, that elegant little trident of modern dining, was viewed with deep suspicion. Some clergy even called it the devil's tool, because apparently, stabbing your food before putting it in your mouth was seen as both arrogant and unnatural. If God wanted us to eat with forks, He wouldn't have given us fingers and bread. Instead, most people used knives, spoons, and hands. And not your own knife. You were expected to bring one. It was part of your everyday carry, like a medieval spork, but sharper and with more street cred. You would slice your meat, pick it up with your fingers, and gently place it into your mouth. No shoveling allowed. Grabbing, slurping, or using your sleeve as a napkin. Utterly scandalous. This wasn't a tavern brawl. This was dinner. Dignity required. Which brings us to hands. Clean hands were essential. Not washed with soap clean. Soap was luxury, but at least wiped on your tunic clean. Before meals, water was brought around in a basin with a towel. You'd rinse your fingers and hope the person before you didn't just gut a fish. This ritual was part hygiene, part social signaling. I'm clean enough to sit next to. Speaking of next to, seating mattered. Great halls often had a top table, reserved for nobles and VIPs, and lower benches for everyone else. The closer to the Lord, the more important you were. The farther down the table, the closer to the dog and the door. Don't take a seat unless invited. Don't hover. And never, ever sit in someone else's place. Unless you enjoyed surprise exile. Now, to the eating. One of the most misunderstood customs was the act of sharing. You didn't get your own plate. You shared a trencher, that flat piece of bread we discussed, with the person next to you. If your table mate was neat, congratulations. If they had a habit of spitting while talking, well, you learned to eat fast. You were also expected to tear your bread, not bite into it like an uncultured woodsman. Don't lick your fingers. Don't gnaw bones unless you plan to do it daintily, which is as ridiculous as it sounds. And for the love of Saint Maudwena, don't reach across the table. That was considered rude, dangerous, and possibly grounds for a duel. Conversation? Allowed, but keep it pious or polite. No gossip, no loud laughter, and definitely no jokes at the expense of your host's dubious pheasant stew. And if the host made a toast, you toasted back. Refusing could be seen as an insult or a sign you suspected poisoning, which, to be fair, was a reasonable fear. And here's a detail you'll love. Burping was acceptable in some circles. It meant you were enjoying yourself. But sneezing? That was an ominous sign, possibly a prelude to the plague. So if you felt a tickle in your nose, best to excuse yourself and go bless your own sneeze in private. As for dessert, if you were lucky, there might be candied fruits or spiced nuts. But don't expect sugar sculptures unless you're at a royal banquet. And even then, don't stare too long. That peacock with gilded feathers might be edible or cursed. Hard to tell. In summary, eat with your hands, bring your own knife, don't touch the Lord's trencher, and above all, try not to die mid-course. That was considered very bad form. You've survived the main course, tore your bread, politely dodged the pickled eel, and only mildly insulted the Lord's salt policy. Well done. Now it's time for dessert. But don't picture a towering cake or a scoop of medieval gelato. Medieval sweets were a strange mix of rare ingredients, visual theater, and culinary trickery. Let's begin with the basic fact. Sugar was not a household item. It was imported, expensive, and exotic. Think of sugar in the 14th century the way we think of truffles or saffron today. A little goes a long way, and too much means someone is showing off. It was sold by apothecaries alongside dried lizards and ground unicorn horn. Okay, rhino horn, but don't tell them that. So when you did encounter sugar, it wasn't dumped into everything the way it is now. It was used sparingly, and usually only by the wealthy. Nobles might have small boxes of sugar stored away like treasure, and it was used not just to sweeten, but to sculpt. That's right, sugar was a building material. Medieval cooks were sugar architects. They created elaborate subtleties, sculpted desserts shaped like castles, saints, unicorns, or entire battle scenes, all made of sugar, marzipan, or almond paste. And here's the kicker. They weren't always meant to be eaten. These creations were displays of power, wealth, and sheer medieval look-what-I-made energy. One famous example, a roasted pig presented at a feast with gilded hooves, an apple in its mouth, and a tiny fortress made of sugar on its back. Because why stop at roasting an animal when you can turn it into a centerpiece of geopolitical dessert theater? Now, for those without access to a personal sugar artist, sweetness came from other sources. Honey was the go-to sweetener across all classes. It was local, natural, and could be used in everything from stews to mead. Dried fruits, figs, dates, raisins were also popular, especially in spiced pastries. These weren't always dessert as we know it, but they were served at the end of meals, often alongside heavily seasoned wine or spiced cider. And then there was something called dragees, sugar-coated spices like fennel or aniseed, served to aid digestion and end the meal on a sweet, crunchy note. Think of them as medieval Tic Tacs, but more like biting into a licorice-scented pebble. Pastries did exist, tarts, pies, fritters, but again, sugar was rare. Instead, cooks used combinations of fruit and spice to give that sweet-savory balance. A pear tart might include ginger and cinnamon, not because it made sense, but because someone read it in a cookbook written by a monk with a sweet tooth and no budget. And, just like everything else in the Middle Ages, desserts came with a touch of symbolism. Almonds were thought to promote fertility, rosewater was refined and fashionable. Eating sweet things could signal not just wealth, but moral superiority. After all, bitter foods were associated with penance. Sweetness meant grace, literal and figurative. But let's not forget the fakes. Some dishes were crafted to look like desserts but weren't. A fish pie might be sculpted to look like a fruit tart. A meatball dyed with beet juice might masquerade as a plum. Medieval cooks loved illusion. It wasn't just about flavor. It was about the element of surprise. Your mouth should be as confused as your soul. So next time you eat a cupcake, remember, in medieval times, that would have cost a week's salary, come with symbolic meaning, and possibly looked like a miniature cathedral. And it might not have tasted like dessert at all. Let's slip behind the tapestries now, past the long tables and the chatter of nobles, and into the part of the castle where real alchemy happened. The medieval kitchen. A space of fire, flavor, frantic shouting, and more than a little superstition. It was hot, crowded, smoky, and if you could survive a day in it, you earned your feast. First, imagine the setup. There's no neat row of chrome appliances, no adjustable gas burners or whisper-quiet dishwashers. The medieval kitchen was centered around one very large, very sooty hearth. Everything, boiling, roasting, baking, revolved around fire. Flames were tended like deities. Cooks didn't just light a fire, they nurtured it, fed it, prayed it didn't sputter out during a roast. There was no temperature control. You judged heat with your hand, your experience, or how long it took for your eyebrows to singe. Baking? That required a separate oven, often outdoors, preheated with actual flames inside it. Once hot enough, the coals were swept out, dough shoved in, and time measured by instinct, intuition, and anxiety. Kitchens were hierarchical. At the top stood the master cook, part chef, part manager, part medieval wizard. Beneath him, assistants, scullions, spitboys, and the occasional terrified servant carrying a goose that wouldn't stop flapping. The spitboys had one job: sit near the fire and slowly rotate the spit for hours. By hand. Think rotisserie chicken, but with childhood trauma. Most kitchens were divided into zones: meat preparation, pastry, boiling, butchery. And they were loud. Cleavers smacked wood. Pans hissed. Someone was always shouting about tripe. There were knives everywhere, and at least one chicken escaping its culinary fate. It wasn't peaceful. It was culinary warfare. But here's the twist. It was also sacred. Certain ingredients were believed to carry spiritual weight. Salt, for instance, was protective. Spilling it? Bad omen. Herbs were more than flavor. They were medicine and magic. Basil for courage, sage for wisdom, rosemary for remembrance, and garlic to ward off evil, or at least hungry guests. And the cooks themselves? Superstitious to the bone. If bread didn't rise, maybe the devil was near. If milk curdled, someone had cast the evil eye. A cracked egg could ruin more than your pudding. It could portend a death in the household. Stirring a pot the wrong direction? That's how curses happen. And heaven forbid you bring in a left-handed onion peeler. Knives weren't just tools. They were symbols of order. A misplaced cleaver might cause misfortune. And wooden spoons? Treasured. If a cook dropped one, they often kissed it or said a quick prayer before continuing. You didn't mess with the kitchen spirits. Some homes even had protective charms hung near the hearth. Herbs, bones, or little wax figures, just in case something unwelcome showed up. Then there was the pantry. You didn't just walk into it. You asked permission. The spice chest? Locked. The salt cellar? Guarded. Flour was weighed. Meat was tracked. Kitchen theft was real. And the punishment often involved shame, stocks, or having your hands paraded through the village while holding the stolen cheese. And don't forget pies. Oh, pies were everywhere. Meat pies, fruit pies, fish pies, mystery pies. The crusts were often more shell than food, made from flour and water, baked to armor-like hardness to preserve the filling. These inedible cases were called coffins, which sounds exactly as unappetizing as it was. The rich ate the filling. The crusts were tossed to the poor, or reused. Yes, reused. In short, the medieval kitchen was a mix of culinary creativity, practical terror, and spiritual respect. It was loud, hot, dangerous, and yet every dish that made it to the table carried a kind of quiet reverence, not just for the food, but for the hands, herbs, and fire that shaped it. Not everyone dined in great halls with peacock sculptures and honey-roasted everything. In fact, most people didn't. The vast majority of medieval Europeans were peasants, farmers, herders, laborers, and their meals were simpler, humbler, and surprisingly communal. So let's take a gentle step inside a 13th century peasant's cottage. One room, dirt floor, smoke curling from a small hearth in the center. The ceiling is low. There's a suspicious draft near the pig, and in the corner a pot bubbles slowly over the fire. That's dinner, and lunch, and possibly breakfast tomorrow. What's in the pot? Probably pottage, the Swiss Army knife of medieval peasant cuisine. Pottage wasn't a single recipe. It was an ongoing, ever-mutating stew made from whatever was on hand. Grains, onions, leeks, turnips, always turnips, and if fortune smiled, a chunk of salted meat or a cracked egg. It simmered constantly. Every day, new ingredients were added. Old bits dissolved. It was less a dish and more a domestic organism. Spices? Rare. Salt? Precious. Garlic, if you grew it. The real flavors came from patience and hunger, and possibly the hope that today's turnip had slightly more personality than yesterday's. Bread accompanied the meal, though not always fresh. For those who couldn't afford an oven or firewood, bread was baked weekly, or at the village bakehouse. It was coarse, dark, and dense. Some loaves were bulked with oat husks, pea flour, or even tree bark in hard times. It was nourishing, but chewing it felt like arm wrestling your own jaw. Now this meal wasn't just food, it was family time, spiritual moment, and neighborhood gossip, all in one. Everyone ate together. Children, parents, maybe the neighbor's orphaned nephew, plus whatever livestock was currently being tolerated indoors. Seating was casual, but respectful. Elders, or the head of the household, were served first. The youngest got what was left, and despite the simplicity, there were table customs. No elbows in the pot. No hogging the best bits. And definitely no insulting the cook, who was usually your mother, your wife, or someone with a ladle and no time for nonsense. Meal prayers were common. Not elaborate. Just a quick thanks to God for the food, even if it was the third bowl of beetroot sludge that week. Eating was seen as a spiritual act. You were grateful. You were lucky to have it. You also avoided talking with your mouth full, partly out of manners, partly because someone might misinterpret your cough as plague. Utensils were minimal. One wooden spoon per person, if that. Knives were shared. Most food was eaten with hands, which is why cleanliness mattered. Within reason, you might be covered in mud from working the fields, but by dinner, your hands were rinsed in cold water, scrubbed on your tunic, and declared clean enough. Drinks? Weak ale, mostly. Water was often unsafe. Cider or small beer were common. Children drank it too, not to get tipsy, but to avoid dying of dysentery. That's a solid parenting move, medieval edition. Meat, when it appeared, was celebrated. A single chicken could feed a family for 2 days, if you boiled the bones after. Feasts, holy days, or weddings brought luxuries: cheese, apples, maybe a cake sweetened with honey and ambition. But most days, just that bubbling pot, and whatever you'd manage not to trade, lose, or accidentally step on. Still, there was comfort in it. A meal shared, a warm bowl passed hand to hand, quiet conversation. The occasional argument about whether this carrot was from last year. It was rustic, yes, but not joyless, not miserable. Because in that small room, by firelight, with steam on the windows and laughter rising above the turnip haze, dinner was more than survival. It was community. It was routine. It was normal. And sometimes, that's the sweetest course of all. Not everything that grew, grazed, or wriggled was fair game in the medieval kitchen. In fact, what people didn't eat tells us just as much about their world as what they did. Behind every empty bowl and untouched root vegetable was a belief, a fear, or a law, often with a side of superstition and the occasional saint's opinion. Let's start with some culinary non-starters: potatoes, tomatoes, and corn. All three are New World crops, completely unknown in medieval Europe. No buttery corn on the cob, no tomato sauce on your trenchers, and certainly no mashed potatoes. The entire Solanaceae family was still chilling in the Americas, waiting to cause global recipe confusion several centuries later. So what did people deliberately avoid? 1. Food forbidden by class medieval menus were often dictated not by taste, but by status. Laws known as sumptuary laws regulated who could eat what. That roast swan? Off limits to commoners. Venison? Only for nobles. Exotic spices or rare fish. You could be fined, or worse, for serving them at a peasant wedding. This wasn't about health. It was about hierarchy. Rich foods were symbolic. Eating above your class was seen as pretentious, threatening, or even ungodly. In some regions, butchers had to mark certain meats with dyes to prevent them being passed off as higher quality. Imagine being the guy caught with unapproved goose on a Wednesday. Scandalous. 2. Food feared for spiritual reasons. Then there were foods feared not because of law, but because of theology. The church had a lot to say about what you should eat, when, and why. Fasting was common, not just during Lent, but also on Wednesdays, Fridays, and eves of major holy days. This didn't mean no food, just no meat from warm-blooded animals. Fish was allowed, but what counted as fish? That's where things got weird. We've already met the aquatic beaver tail, accepted as fish for its swampy lifestyle. But other odd inclusions made the list. Barnacle geese, because people thought they grew on driftwood. Puffins, water birds equals fish, apparently. And even whales. Imagine blessing a chunk of whale blubber and calling it seafood. The theological gymnastics were truly Olympic. Shellfish, though technically allowed, weren't popular with everyone. Some believed they were spiritually unclean or simply too strange-looking. And snails? Well, depending on the region, they were either forbidden or enthusiastically farmed in monastic gardens. There was no middle ground on snails. 3. Food rejected for health and weird logic. Some foods were avoided because medieval physicians warned against them. According to the beloved but wildly outdated humoral theory, everything you ate affected the balance of your bodily fluids. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much onion? Might make you aggressive. Cabbage, considered dangerous for melancholic types. Cold fruits like melons or cucumbers were said to weaken your innards. Even cheese was controversial. Aged cheese was praised for strength, but soft cheese was viewed with suspicion. Too moist, too tempting, possibly corrupting. Garlic was both miracle and menace. Good for heart, bad for manners. Beans? Nutritious, but also known for their ahem musical side effects, which were considered unholy at the dinner table. And, speaking of health, raw food of any kind was frowned upon. Uncooked vegetables were viewed as risky and possibly demonic. Fruit was often baked, stewed, or pickled before consumption. A raw apple was more alarming than appetizing, unless it was part of a saint's miracle or your neighbor's cider experiment. 4. Food refused for practical reasons. Finally, some things were just too much. Some animals were too valuable to eat. Cats, dogs, and horses were rarely on the menu, not because of affection necessarily, but because they had other jobs. Horses plowed, cats caught mice. Dogs protected chickens from being eaten, and occasionally became the emergency food themselves during sieges. But no one advertised that. Insects were a no-go. Not out of revulsion, but because they were seen as pests, curses, or divine punishments. No one wanted to be caught munching on the spiritual embodiment of wrath. Mushrooms? Tricky. Some were loved. Others were feared as fairy food or death traps. Unless your village had a resident mushroom expert, usually an old woman with a strong stomach and a mysterious past, best to avoid. In short, medieval people avoided foods for reasons ranging from logical to theological to downright mythical. Their diet wasn't just shaped by geography or economy, it was curated by belief, class, medicine, and the occasional panicked rumor about goats whispering at night. So next time someone turns their nose up at your snack, just remember, in the 1300s, someone refused cabbage because it might unbalance their spleen. Picture this. It's dawn in a medieval village. The rooster's crowing, someone's already arguing with a goat, and the fire's been stoked for breakfast. A child stumbles sleepily to the table, rubs their eyes, and takes a swig of beer. Yes, beer. Before breakfast, before shoes, before basic hygiene. But don't panic. It wasn't party time. This was small beer, a watered-down, low-alcohol version of the good stuff, brewed specifically for everyday drinking. Because in the medieval world, water, that clear, innocent-looking liquid, was one of the riskiest things you could consume. Rivers were open sewage. Wells were easily contaminated. Rainwater was unpredictable. And no one was boiling anything unless they had a reason. So beer became the beverage of survival. Even children drank it, not to get buzzed, but to avoid dying of dysentery before noon. Small beer was brewed quickly, consumed fast, and often made at home. It was cloudy, warm, and mildly funky. But at least it didn't try to murder you quietly like the village well did. And when you wanted to feel fancy, you upgraded to stronger ales or mead. Mead, honey wine. A staple of medieval feasting, often associated with Vikings, bards, and romantic moonlit banquets. In truth, mead was sweet, strong, and a bit unpredictable. It was also a status drink. Honey wasn't cheap, and neither was the time it took to ferment. So if you were sipping mead by the fire, chances are you were a guest, a noble, or someone with good blackmail material on the local lord. Wine, meanwhile, was a symbol of class. It flowed more freely in southern Europe, where grapes grew better and monasteries doubled as wineries. Monks were surprisingly skilled vintners and enthusiastic tasters. They didn't just drink wine, they infused it with herbs, spices, and, occasionally, dubious medical ambition. Want to impress your guests? Serve wine with wormwood. It's bitter, possibly poisonous, but it shows you care. Other infusions included cinnamon, rosemary, sage, or cloves, turning a simple sip into a medieval cocktail of confusion and courage. But don't assume wine was always posh. Most wine was, let's say, rustic. It was stored in wooden barrels, exposed to air, and often started turning into vinegar by the time it reached your goblet. To fix this, servers might mix it with water, herbs, or, in extreme cases, sugar. A strong red with a splash of swamp? Perfectly normal. Then there were ciders and perry, Fermented apple or pear drinks, more common in northern regions. They were tart, lively, and often brewed at home. If you were lucky, they were refreshing. If you were really lucky, they didn't explode in the barrel mid-fermentation. And let's not forget distilled spirits. Though rare in most of the Middle Ages, they did begin to appear later. They were known as aqua vitae, water of life. Ironically, they tasted like fire and regret. Often used medicinally, they were said to restore balance, revive the sick, and make you forget that you just ate a pickled beetroot by accident. In terms of etiquette, drinking had rules. You didn't chug unless you were celebrating. You raised your goblet to toast. You made eye contact. You didn't drink before your superior, and if you spilled, that was either bad luck or a sign that your guest was cursed. Either way, a napkin wouldn't save you. And when you were really poor, you might have to make do with posset, a mixture of curdled milk, ale, and spices. It sounds like something you'd feed a goat with a cold, but it was surprisingly popular. Served warm, it was both beverage and soft food. Medieval protein shake, anyone? So yes, beer for breakfast, wine for weddings, and mead for the gods. But water? Water was for bathing. Maybe, and even then you sniffed it first. So you finished your medieval meal, whether it was pottage in a smoky cottage, goose under gold leaf at a noble's hall, or somewhere in between. One truth remains. Your stomach is now full of bread, herbs, and existential questions. But the eating doesn't just stop. This is the Middle Ages. Digestion was considered a sacred journey, and how you finished your meal was almost as important as how you began it. Let's start with the spiritual angle. Most meals ended, as they began, with prayer. A quiet thanks for the food, the company, and the fact that nobody choked on a chicken bone or turned purple from the pickled eel. Monks had specific after-dinner blessings. Even peasants often mumbled a quick Deo gratias before rolling back into their chores or their straw piles. For the wealthier, the post-meal ritual was more elaborate. The lavabo, a hand-washing ceremony, often returned after the feast. Water, scented with herbs like rosemary or lavender, was poured over the hands. This wasn't just about cleanliness, though that helped. It was symbolic, washing away the meal, starting fresh. Or, if you were really full, stalling for time so you didn't explode like an overstuffed trencherman. Next came spiced comfits, tiny sugar-coated seeds like fennel, aniseed, or coriander. These were the medieval answer to breath mints and Tums combined. Sweet, crunchy, and allegedly good for digestion, they were often served in ornate dishes and passed around the table like polite edible confetti. And then came the herbal remedies. Cooks, medics, and herbalists all had opinions on what to do after dinner. Mint, chamomile, or sage tea. Yes, please. A spoonful of vinegar mixed with honey, if you must. Need to sleep off the meat sweats? Try valerian root and a prayer to Saint Apollonia. On the slightly less charming end of the spectrum, forced vomiting. Yep. Some upper-class diners, especially in the later Middle Ages, would eat until full, then excuse themselves, purge discreetly, and return for dessert. Not everyone did this, of course, but enough for it to become part of the decadent noble stereotype, the medieval version of saving room, just in a truly horrifying way. For those with less stomach for drama, there were simpler rituals, a short walk, a fireside seat, or just a gentle lean back and burp moment, accepted in some circles, frowned upon in others. Burping wasn't universally rude. In some cultures, it was a sign of appreciation. In others, it was a sign that you needed more comfits. Then came the toothpicks. Yes, they had them. Usually made of wood or bone, they were used to clear out breadcrumbs, bits of roasted swan, or the occasional pea that had gone rogue. Wealthy guests often carried personal picks, sometimes elaborately carved. Others used what was handy: a twig, a feather, or, in a pinch, the corner of a linen napkin that definitely wasn't theirs. As the fire dimmed and the hall quieted, conversation softened. Wine gave way to cider, storytelling began, and slowly, guests peeled away. No one lingered too long. Beds were cold, and nights were long. You didn't want to be caught in the dark without a candle or a good reason. And so, meals ended not with dessert carts or cappuccinos, but with a sigh, a blessing, and the slow shuffle toward rest. A belly full, a soul quieted, and the gentle hope that tomorrow's bread would be slightly less crunchy. Because in the medieval world, a good meal wasn't just nourishment. It was survival, celebration, and sometimes a miracle. When you think feast in the medieval world, your mind might conjure long wooden tables, kings with fur-lined cloaks, and someone dramatically tearing into a turkey leg. While that last bit is probably thanks to movies rather than reality, medieval feasts were real, and they were something else entirely. These weren't just big dinners. Feasts were events, social performances, and sometimes political campaigns disguised as potlucks. From royal coronations to saints' days, weddings to military victories, if you could roast it, stuff it, or put a crown on it, it could end up on a feast table. And we're not just talking about a few extra courses. A proper royal feast might involve over 100 dishes, spread across several courses, each more theatrical than the last. In 1399, for example, during the coronation feast of Henry IV, the kitchen staff reportedly prepared over 5,000 dishes. 5,000. That's not dinner, that's logistics. Let's look at the layout. Tables weren't casually set. The top table, for royalty or honored guests, was often raised on a platform, decorated with fine linen, and flanked by musicians or jesters. Lower-ranking guests sat at long trestle tables, where plates were more likely to be wooden than silver, and elbows were more tolerated. The courses would come out in waves. The first might include breads, stews, and roasted meats. The second brought the wow factor: spiced peacock redressed in its own feathers, a boar's head with an apple in its mouth, or pies that released live birds when sliced. Yes, really. The third course, if you survived that long, might be sweets, cheeses, and digestives. It wasn't just about what you served, it was how you presented it. One feast reportedly featured a swan roasted whole, its feathers reattached, and gold leaf brushed across its wings. Some meats were dyed with saffron to appear more exotic. Even illusion food played a role. Meat sculpted to look like fish, fish sculpted to look like fruit, and one very confused jelly shaped like a miniature castle. Feasts were full of symbolism. Serving certain birds, like heron or crane, conveyed nobility and control over nature. Lamb symbolized Christ. Spices symbolized wealth. And sugar sculptures of saints or mythical creatures reminded guests that they were not only well-fed, but also deeply spiritual, or at least that the cook had read a Bible once. Entertainment was built in. Minstrels roamed between tables. Storytellers recited epics. Acrobats did questionable things with torches. And yes, there were jesters. But not just the silly hat kind. Some were sharp-witted political satirists who could insult a duke while balancing a turnip on their nose. Drinking was generous, but not always wild. Hosts wanted guests merry, not messy. But there were feasts, especially during weddings or holidays, where the ale flowed freely and dancing on tables wasn't out of the question. Still, vomiting in a noblewoman's headdress was a faux pas, even in the 1300s. Not everyone ate everything. Servants circulated with trays, offering dishes to select guests. Refusing was acceptable, if done politely. And yes, leftovers were common. Huge feasts often fed the kitchen staff, local poor, or monastery workers for days after. For the host, the feast was a display of power. Feeding hundreds of people meant you had resources. Serving exotic ingredients meant you had connections. Offering comfort, warmth, and a good laugh meant you had influence. In a time before PR firms and press conferences, feasting was your public image. And yes, some did overdo it. Gluttony was technically a sin, but it could be excused if you were celebrating something very important, like your cousin's canonization or finally getting the sheep to stay out of your herb garden. So the next time you hear medieval feast, don't just imagine roasted meat. Picture noise, color, performance, scent, spice, politics, power, and a boar's head wearing a lemon. It was food, yes, but it was also theater, theology, and a very bold use of goose fat. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just something you enjoyed. It was something that could fix you, calm you, balance your body, and occasionally summon the approval of the saints. Medicine and mealtime weren't separate worlds. They were deeply entwined, and sometimes disastrously so. Let's start with the guiding principle, the theory of humors. No, not humor like jokes, though some medieval cures would absolutely qualify as such. The humors were the 4 bodily fluids that supposedly ruled your health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one. You were imbalanced. Too little. Also imbalanced. The solution? Adjust your diet. Every food was categorized by its temperature and moisture: hot or cold, wet or dry. Bread, for instance, was dry and warm. Lettuce, cold and moist. Garlic, very hot. Cabbage, suspiciously gassy. You see where this is going. Feeling melancholy? Too much black bile? You might be given warm, dry foods, like roasted meats or wine infused with rosemary. Too energetic? Excess blood? Cooled stews with mint or cucumber might be recommended. And if you were just out of sorts, your local healer might simply tell you to avoid cheese and oranges, which, let's be honest, still sounds like modern health advice. One of the most popular food medicine hybrids? Broth. It was universally comforting, endlessly adaptable, and easy on the digestion. Cooks and medics alike recommended broths with leeks, garlic, and herbs. Add a bit of meat or egg yolk, and voila, healing potion. Or at least something warm that didn't fight your intestines. Then there were herbs. Every household had a few favorites, often grown in a garden just outside the kitchen or monastery. Sage. He who has sage in his garden needs no doctor, they said. Used for digestion, memory, and spiritual protection. Mint. Good for stomach aches and breath, and possibly for discouraging mice. Fennel. Thought to sharpen vision and cure flatulence. Dual purpose. Rue. A powerful herb, used carefully, often to ward off plague or malevolent spirits. Slightly terrifying, slightly tasty. For those feeling particularly daring, there was aleberry, a warm drink made of ale, sugar, and toasted bread, served to the sick or those suffering from chills. It sounds cozy until you remember that most ale had sediment and most sugar came in hard cones you had to chisel apart. Feeling weak? Try a posset. Hot milk curdled with ale or wine, sometimes with spices added, like drinking a warm, chunky hug. And yes, it was believed to bring strength, or at least help you sleep through whatever ailed you. And speaking of sleep, food was deeply tied to your nightly routine. Medieval people believed that eating late at night made your dreams chaotic, and your sleep restless. Heavy meals could cause nightmares or, according to one 12th century monk, foul phantoms. That's not a phrase you want associated with your lentil stew. Sweet things were often prescribed for melancholy. Sugar, when available, was treated like a drug, literally sold by apothecaries. Candied ginger or sugared almonds were recommended for digestive health. Comfits, those sugar-coated seeds we mentioned earlier, were said to settle the stomach and lift the spirits. And let's not forget the miraculous foods, items so steeped in religious lore that their consumption was halfway between nourishment and prayer. Bread, blessed by a priest. Wine infused with relics. Even bread and cheese used in trial by ordeal. If the accused choked, they were guilty. If they swallowed, the saints approved. Trial and snack in one. Lastly, fasting wasn't just about piety. It was also seen as a reset for the body. Abstaining from meat, rich food, or alcohol was thought to purify the spirit and rebalance your inner humors. Some monks took this to extremes, surviving on little more than thin beer and raw herbs for months. It didn't always end well, but it did impress the neighbors. So in the Middle Ages, your pantry was your pharmacy, your meal was your medicine, and your cook, possibly your most trusted healer. Unless, of course, they also believed that burnt toast cured the plague. In the Middle Ages, food didn't just nourish the body, it shaped your soul. Every bite could be a blessing, every fast an act of devotion. Whether you were nibbling a crust in a monastery or tucking into roast lamb on Easter Sunday, your plate was intimately connected to your spiritual life. Let's begin with the most sacred rule of medieval eating. When you ate mattered just as much as what you ate. There were no cheat days in the Christian calendar, but there were many fast days. In fact, for most medieval Christians, nearly half the year was spent in some form of dietary restriction. Lent, Advent, Ember Days, Saints, Days, Vigil Days, and every single Friday, plus most Wednesdays, required abstention from meat. That's right. Imagine your modern meatless Monday, stretched out over 180 days a year. But fasting didn't necessarily mean going hungry. It meant avoiding certain foods, particularly meat from warm-blooded animals. Fish? Fair game. Eggs? Debated. Dairy? Controversial. The rules shifted depending on the century, the region, and whether your local bishop had a forgiving mood or a grudge against cheese. And let's be honest, people got creative. The infamous beaver tail loophole, beaver being classed as a fish because it swam, was just the beginning. Barnacle geese, thought to grow on trees and fall into the ocean, were also ruled fish in certain regions. Monks once tried to classify otters as fish. It was dietary theology at its most imaginative. Monasteries, which should have been the most devout, often led the way in food innovation. While they adhered to the rules on the surface, many had exceptional cooks, well-stocked gardens, and generous donors. Lent might forbid butter, but almond milk was allowed, so they made everything with almond milk. Stews, sauces, even faux cheese. It was fasting, yes, but it was also delicious. Feasts, on the other hand, were glorious. The liturgical calendar was full of feast days, holy events that required celebration with food, drink, and pageantry. Easter, Christmas, All Saints' Day, and local saint festivals were marked with abundance. Tables overflowed with roast meats, baked goods, and symbolic foods, lamb for Christ, bread for the body, wine for the blood, and sweets for the soul. Many of these foods carried spiritual meanings. Bread wasn't just bread, it was sacred, especially when blessed. In fact, the line between food and ritual was often blurred. Parishioners might take home leftover communion bread to guard against illness. Farmers might bury bits of feast bread in their fields for a good harvest. Certain foods were even linked to miracles. Saints were said to multiply loaves, make stew from air, or bless cheese that never went moldy. Pilgrims often received special foods at shrines, symbolic treats to mark their journey and spiritual effort. A bowl of lentils from St. Benedict's kitchen. That was both dinner and divine encouragement. Food taboos were also a part of religious life. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins, and overindulgence was frowned upon, especially in public. Monks were warned not to request second helpings. Priests were advised to eat modestly, lest they be seen as worldly. Some saints even rejected food entirely, living on little more than herbs and water, or, in a few cases, just the Eucharist. And let's not forget the Church's role in controlling food culture. Tithes often included grain, produce, or livestock. Church courts could fine you for eating meat on a fast day, and if you really misbehaved, you might be sentenced to public fasting. Not a spa cleanse, but a very public act of penance, usually while wearing something itchy and regrettable. But there was joy, too. Religious festivals brought communities together. After church, people gathered to share special dishes, often cooked outdoors. Even the poorest might get a slice of blessed bread or a ladle of festive stew. In a world of constant work and worry, faith-filled feasts were moments of light, warmth, and hope. So yes, medieval meals were ruled by religion, but within those rules, people found ways to express joy, generosity, and even a little culinary rebellion. Because nothing says devotion like almond milk butter on Lenten bread, served next to a fish with webbed feet and feathers. When we think of medieval cooking, it's easy to picture a nameless peasant woman hunched over a smoky fire, her hair in a scarf, her hands busy with onions and bread dough. And yes, women did cook, a lot. But the reality of who prepared food in the Middle Ages is far more layered and much more interesting than a one-size-fits-all apron. To begin, we need to separate the idea of home cooking from institutional cooking. In small homes, especially in rural villages, it was typically the woman of the house who managed food preparation. She baked the bread, stirred the pottage, gathered herbs, and probably knew exactly which chicken had been giving her attitude all week. But even in these domestic spaces, cooking wasn't always a one-woman show. Children helped. Men might butcher meat or manage the fire. And in lean times, cooking was often a group effort, more about survival than tradition. Now shift your eyes to a castle kitchen or a monastery refectory, and the scene changes entirely. Here, cooking became male-dominated and highly hierarchical. These weren't cozy family meals. They were logistical feats involving dozens of servants, assistants, and specialists. And the cook? Almost always a man. In wealthy households, the master cook was a position of power. He didn't just cook. He managed a team, controlled budgets, ordered exotic ingredients, and sometimes even dabbled in the alchemical art of digestion. His kitchen was a blend of culinary command center and performance stage. Flames leapt, knives flashed, and someone shouted about an undersalted heron. Even among the lower classes, men frequently took over when food production scaled up. Think of bakeries, butcher shops, breweries, all essential food services, and all often run by men. Women were involved, of course, especially in brewing, but formal guilds were mostly male, and legal ownership of food businesses could be tricky for women without husbands or patrons. And yet, women were everywhere in the food world, just less often in the spotlight. They worked in the background, grinding flour, carrying water, churning butter. They ran alehouses, served food in inns, and acted as nurses and cooks in hospitals. Many were herbalists, combining food and medicine with quiet, competent grace. Women also held a special place in the folk traditions around food. Recipes, passed orally from mother to daughter, contained not just ingredients, but superstitions, charms, and household wisdom. How to calm a colicky baby with fennel tea. What stew to make when your husband won't stop sneezing. Which bread dough to whisper a prayer over during storms. There's a lovely irony here. While the official cooks were men, It was often women who knew how to feed you when it really mattered. Of course, gender rules weren't fixed. In some areas, women did become professional cooks. They might run kitchens in noble households or take over family food businesses. And during times of war or plague, when men were absent or dying, women stepped in fully, sometimes permanently, into these roles. Even in literature and law, food was gendered. Too much eating? Male gluttony. Too much fuss about flavor? Female vanity. A man who loved food was hardy. A woman who loved food was suspicious. And a woman who sold sweets. Let's just say she was sometimes accused of selling more than sugar. But for all the biases, the lines were flexible. What mattered most was who had time, who had access, and who had to make something from nothing. And more often than not, that someone was a woman, stirring the pot while the fire smoked, and the baby cried, and the barley boiled, and the neighbors knocked. So yes, men cooked in castles, women cooked in cottages, and everyone, at some point, was elbow deep in leaks. Because hunger didn't care about gender. Imagine a world without freezers, no Tupperware, no expiration dates, and definitely no frantic 2 a.m. trips to the fridge for leftovers. In the Middle Ages, food preservation wasn't optional. It was essential. If you didn't know how to store your harvest, cure your meat, or trick a fish into surviving the winter in a barrel, you were going to have a very hungry February. And somehow, they managed. Not just managed, they preserved, innovated, and, mostly, survived. Let's take a stroll through the pantry medieval style. 1. Salt. The MVP of preservation salt was the medieval refrigerator. It dried meat, cured fish, and gave life to butter that would have otherwise expired faster than a monk's patience during Lent. Salting pulled moisture from food, inhibiting the bacteria that love a damp party. Meat, especially pork and fish, was packed in barrels with layers of salt and left to slowly transform into something tougher, drier, and much longer lasting. Salt was expensive, mined from rock or evaporated from seawater, and often taxed. Some towns owed their entire economy to the salt trade. Wars were fought over it. Ransoms paid in it. It wasn't just a seasoning. It was survival. 2. Smoking. Because everything tastes better, slightly charred smoking wasn't just for adding flavor to ham and sausage. It was preservation. Smokehouses, common across villages and monasteries, suspended meats over slow-burning fires. The smoke dried the surface, created a protective coating, and added just enough mystique to make future generations crave smoked cheese. In colder months, families might hang meats in the rafters, letting both smoke and cold air preserve them. That way, your bacon could last the season, or at least until your cousin accidentally ate half of it while pretending to check on the chickens. 3. Drying, the art of controlled shriveling grains, were stored dry, of course. But fruits, herbs, mushrooms, and even some meats were dried in the sun, near ovens or above the hearth. Dried apples, pears, and plums made excellent travel snacks and winter treats. Some were rehydrated in wine or ale and used in pies and stews, or just gnawed on like ancient fruit leather. And herbs? Dried bundles hung from ceiling beams. Decorative, yes, but also the medieval equivalent of a spice rack. Lavender for linen, sage for stew, rue for whatever rue does, probably ward off demons. 4. Pickling. Acidic adventure pickling wasn't limited to cucumbers. Almost anything could go in a brine. Onions, cabbage, eggs, even fish. Vinegar, salt water, or fermented whey were used to create environments hostile to bacteria and friendly to long shelf lives. Sauerkraut was a favorite in colder climates, both for its taste and its uncanny ability to prevent scurvy before anyone knew what scurvy was. And pickled herring? Let's just say it had a loyal fan base and an aggressive smell. Some households kept pickling crocks, large ceramic containers filled with preserved vegetables, often hidden in cool cellars or buried for insulation. The flavor was strong, but the effect? Effective. 5. Fermenting. Delicious, dubious science fermentation was everywhere, in bread, beer, cheese, and even sauces. One particularly notorious creation was garum, a fish sauce inherited from the Romans, made by letting small fish rot in the sun and then bottling the resulting liquid. It was used like soy sauce or Worcestershire. Just don't ask what it smelled like going in. Dairy was quickly transformed into butter, curds, or hard cheeses. Soft cheeses spoiled fast. Hard cheeses could last for months. Some were waxed, some were smoked, some were just brave. Bread, when stale, was turned into sops, soaked in wine or broth to become edible again. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a second act. Even stale beer could end up in soup. 6. Cool storage, nature's refrigerator. For those lucky enough to have cellars, ice pits, or deep wells, cool storage became a lifesaver. Clay pots wrapped in wet cloth were used to keep things cooler. Stone floors helped, and during the winter, snow or ice was sometimes packed into underground pits and insulated with straw, lasting deep into spring. Some noble households had entire ice houses, large, insulated structures for storing ice and perishable goods. The medieval version of a walk-in freezer, minus the door handle. All of these methods weren't just clever, they were necessary. Preserving food meant surviving through seasons of scarcity, feeding unexpected guests, and reducing waste long before recycling bins were a thing. And yet, despite the salt and the smoke and the vinegar soaked everything, people still managed to eat well, or at least eat enough. They turned limitation into creativity. They transformed surplus into strategy. So the next time your leftovers last a few days in the fridge, remember, someone once had to hang bacon in the rafters, pickle their cabbage underground, and trust that no mice were planning a heist. That's preservation. Medieval style. And that's where we'll leave our journey tonight, with the last embers glowing in a cottage hearth, the scent of herbs still lingering, and a bit of bread saved for morning. Whether you imagined yourself in a monk's quiet kitchen or at a roaring noble feast, I hope the stories brought you a little closer to the rhythms of another time. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this slow stroll through history, consider subscribing or leaving a quiet little like. It helps more sleepy souls find their way here. Until next time, rest well, and may your dreams be filled with turnips that don't argue, cheese that never molds, and ale that never runs dry. Good night.